Hi, good evening. I'm Lonnie Stonich, the Executive Director of FAN, and I'm honored to welcome you to tonight's conversation between Adam Alter and David Epstein. Thanks for joining us. FAN celebrates its 40th anniversary this year, and we're honored to have the robust support of dozens of schools, nonprofits, corporations, families, and individuals from across the country. We're committed to our vision of an informed and compassionate community, and we'll achieve that vision by presenting fresh ideas that elevate minds, expand hearts, and make the world a better place. We have hundreds of videos of past events archived on our YouTube channel, so be sure to subscribe to get updates when new recordings are posted. And now for some introductions. Adam Alter is a professor of marketing at New York University's Stern School of Business and the Robert Stansky Teaching Excellence Faculty Fellow, and with an affiliated appointment in NYU's Psychology Department. He's the New York Times bestselling author of 2 books, Irresistible from 2017, which considers why so many people today are addicted to so many behaviors, from incessant smartphone and internet use to video game playing and online shopping, and his previous book from 2013, Drunk Tank Pink, which investigates how hidden forces in the world around us shape our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. We had the privilege of hosting Adam in 2017 when Irresistible was released, and we are very excited and honored to welcome him back again. David Epstein is a science writer and author of the New York Times bestsellers Range, Why Generalists Triumph in a Specialized World, and The Sports Gene. He was previously an investigative reporter at ProPublica, and prior to that, a senior writer at Sports Illustrated. His 2 TED Talks on human development and performance have been viewed 12 million times and counting. We welcome David in both 2016 and in 2020, and we're thrilled that he is paired with Adam tonight. So now let's welcome Adam Alter and David Epstein.
Great to hear, Adam. I should say I'll put this cover up now and again because I love this cover. The combination of the light bulb and it exploding, I just think is such a unique and powerful image. So I'll put it up a few times while we're going to remind people to check it out. Beautiful one to have turned out on your shelf, I think.
Thank you.
Adam, I want to start with I think as I've gotten older as a writer, I've increasingly realized that the things I want to research have a pretty strong me-search component to them. And I actually don't think I really realized that prospectively for a lot of my big projects. But then I look back at them and see this thread of like, oh, of course I was interested in that thing. And, my first book about genetics and athleticism really was questions that had just lodged in my head from my own experiences, either viewing or participating. And so I'm curious with stuckness, this topic of feeling stuck or being stuck or hitting a plateau in your life. What's the genesis of this for you? Because my guess is that there's an element of me search somewhere in this for you.
There are 2 elements of me search, actually. So there are 2. One of them is academic and one of them is personal. The academic one is where I got interested in the topic broadly. And it started about 15, 20 years ago when I was studying how people around the world perceive change and anticipate change. And I found this really interesting cultural difference. So what you find is that people in the West, places like the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the UK, tend to be blindsided by change in general. They think that a trend is just going to continue. And when it doesn't continue, they're surprised by that. So you could tell them, for example, that it's been sunny for 5 days or rainy for 5 days, or that the stock market has ticked upward for 5 days or ticked downward for 5 days. And then you say to them, what's going to happen next? And they think whatever's been happening will continue to happen. People in the East, people in particular, South Korea, Japan, and China, think that everything's about to change all the time. They're very open to the idea of shifting between endpoints as night becomes day. This is all associated with the yin yang and Taoism broadly. And what that means is if you hold that view, you're much more open to the idea that things are going to shift and you're going to need to be nimble in the face of those shifts. So I got very interested in this idea that we in the West, not anticipating change, are going to be really poorly prepared for the many changes that actually do happen, and that might entrench us. And so that's where I first got interested in this. But the personal answer, it started maybe 4 or 5 years before that. When I was an undergrad, I was studying actuarial science at the University of New South Wales in Australia, which I was very lucky. I got a fellowship and I was studying on the fellowship, and every week a little bit of money would be deposited into an account for me. And one day, about 6 months in, I was not enjoying the course at all. The head of the course came in and said, if you stay in the course for another week, but then after that decide to leave the program at some point, you're going to have to pay all that money back. And so it became clear to me immediately that I had to leave right that minute. And I was deeply, deeply and profoundly stuck. I had no idea what I was supposed to be doing with my time, and no idea what I should be doing with my career. All I knew was that I really didn't like actuarial science. It wasn't for me. And so I ended up, something I talk about in the book, actually, I ended up bouncing around from one program to another. I would sit in on an English lecture, then a philosophy lecture, then a mathematics lecture, then a law lecture, then a psychology lecture. And so I kind of drank in all of these different disciplines and experimented my way to psychology and law, which were the two that I ended up in. And I didn't think much of it at the time, but I always sort of kept it in the back of my mind. And it turned out to be this kind of accidental thing a friend of mine and I did that was a great unsticking mechanism. And then I got really interested in whether there are ways to kind of hasten periods of stuckness and also to modulate them, to sort of downgrade them so that they don't feel quite so intense. And that's where this all came from.
So that sort of period of sampling for you got you unstuck. And I want to go back to that in a sec, but just so, because this is a concept that in your book, I think when you say something like stuck, I think everyone has an intuitive feel for what you're talking about. But I think you go to, but one of the things in a lot of the nonfiction books that I most enjoy, like this book, give me sort of a more visceral framework for something I was thinking about, but didn't exactly know how I was thinking about it. That a lot of kind of thoughts were orbiting, but I just didn't have the framework to sort of channel my thoughts about it so that I could have kind of more interesting and productive internal conversations. And I think you did that with stuckness. So I want to go back to your sampling period in a sec, but can we take a second, you describe a little bit this idea of stuckness so that people can have that frame as they think about what you're saying?
Yeah. So when I talk about stuckness, there are lots of sort of lay definitions of what it means to be stuck, right? You could be stuck very briefly, but I'm generally talking about this experience that lasts. It could be a week, many weeks, months, sometimes years. And for some people that I've spoken to, it's decades or even a whole lifetime where you feel that you're stuck in a particular place you don't want to be. So we're talking about protracted and often chronic stuckness. The case that I mentioned with my studies, that went on for months. I really was unsure of what to do. And so that was really difficult for a period of months, but often it's longer than that. But the second criterion that has to be present is, like March 2020, we were all stuck in place. We couldn't move. The government had decided that we shouldn't travel because of the pandemic. That's not psychologically interesting to me in and of itself as a form of stuckness, because there's not that much we can do about it.
Mm-hmm.
What I'm more interested in is the kind of stuckness where we have some agency, where we have some power to unstick the situation, to lubricate it a bit. And it's protracted, generally speaking, and it feels pretty bad is a third thing, but also we have some power to do something about it.
And I mean, you've been conducting a survey, right? I think an international survey of stuckness. How common a feeling is this?
It's borderline universal. So what I mean is that when you say to people, is there an area in your life where you feel a little bit stuck, or where things haven't moved the way you'd like them to have over a period of time? Almost everyone says yes. And it takes them about between 10 and 30 seconds to be able to draw that to mind and then to start typing about it. You can track all of this in these surveys. So it's not quite universal, but it's very, very close, where people can point to something and say, whether it's relationships, whether it's financial, career-based, athletic, artistic, creative, it doesn't matter. Most people have something that feels like it's fixed in place. They often turn their mind away from it, but when they train their view towards it, they recognize it and they can be quite articulate about it.
Interesting. It's interesting to know that it's so ubiquitous. And is that feeling of stuckness distinctly different from, say, just sort of, failing, for lack of a better term, because you could be moving, but kind of feeling like you're going backwards? Is it more of sort of because I could see how it might be even more insidious if it's sometimes, if you're getting negative feedback on something, you kind of, like it sounded with you in actuarial sciences, without a stimulus, you may have stayed the course a little longer just by momentum, right? It doesn't sound like you were getting such negative feedback yet that you might not have jumped unless something forced you. So I wonder if there's an even more insidious aspect to stuckness than just kind of going in the wrong direction, because it may take longer to sort of realize you have to do something. Is that, am
Yeah.
I articulating that at all?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of people, when they respond, say exactly that. They say, it snuck up on me to an extent, right? It's something that it was a situation that was fixed in place for perhaps months. And then one day they woke up and said, how did I get here? And so it's this kind of creeping thing that gets sometimes worse and more entrenched. And it hits a sort of threshold where people say, this doesn't feel good anymore. And I'm now going to describe what I feel as being stuck. What's really interesting to me, though, is there are people who struggle with something. You mentioned failure or not being able to progress or succeed. There are people who are in a state of essentially failure for decades, but they don't feel stuck. So you get this as well. I had this conversation with a mutual friend of ours, Malcolm Gladwell, and one of the things he mentioned was
we used to be running buddies, by the way. So we used to argue on this stuff about this stuff on our own time when the three of us, when we could breathe, which was not most of the time.
That's true. That's true. The three of us would discuss this stuff. But he was telling me and telling the audience in this conversation about his dad, who was a mathematician, and he was wrestling with a problem for 30 years, but he didn't feel stuck. He couldn't get the answer. He spent 30 years in essentially, as far as mathematicians are concerned, in a state of not having succeeded, but enjoyed every minute of it. So it's very subjective. And so you can be in exactly the same objective state where you're not making progress, feel that it's okay, and then maybe one day you don't feel it's okay anymore. Or really, you could feel it's okay for the entire time you're in that experience. So it's very much about how we interpret it. And that's one of the themes in the book as well.
So it requires that sort of negative emotional aspect of you wanting to get out of it, but for whatever reason have not been getting out of it.
Exactly.
And I think everyone can probably come up with some, envision what this means in a career, but I'm curious, since you've heard from a lot of people, either an example or maybe some of the themes that come out of people's personal life or their relationships, like how do they kind of describe the feeling of stuckness in sort of a personal relationship where it's not as objective as being stuck in some level in their profession?
Yeah, it's interesting. It varies dramatically, and it varies not just in terms of the domain, but also in terms of how abstract or concrete it is. So I had people who said things like, I've been practicing this piano piece for literally months. It's killing me. I can't sleep at night. I can't figure it out. I'm stuck. It's a very concrete, very precise, very narrow case of stuckness. And then there are people who will say something like, I just feel this sense of ennui. I just don't feel good. And I think it's my job. And I just feel stuck in general. And it's very broad. And then there are people who'll talk about relationships they're in that don't feel like they should continue, but they just don't know what sort of move to make. So that's a very emotional form of stuckness. There are creatives who are working on a particular project. There are a lot of professions that involve creative work, and they just don't know how to progress. They want to be here and they're down here. A lot of athletes as well, which obviously is something you focused a lot on and I think is really fascinating, who will describe, particularly as they improve, they'll get to a point where they hit what feels like a plateau, and that feels very frustrating to them. And that seems to be very common as you get better at pretty much anything, that eventually you hit a point where you feel stuck or like you can't make the progress beyond this particular plateau. So it's tremendously broad. One more, I'll say, financial is very common. So people feel financially stuck where they feel that they're constrained in certain ways. And often it's a situation where they say, I know what the right thing is to do. My better self would be doing it, but I just can't seem to exert the self-control required. And that, sometimes that's true with eating, with saving behavior, with exercise. Yeah, it's a few different areas.
Okay, I promised I was going to go back to your sampling period, but actually I'm going to keep diverting because that was really interesting when the idea that people will know what they should be doing. And I guess we all have those sorts of things in our lives, but what principles would you advise for that once somebody has realized, and they just can't do it, whether it's exercise, eating, or something in their work life, or procrastination, or a new way they need to treat relationships? How should they think about it? Because obviously they're recognizing that they're mired.
Yeah.
What's the approach to take if you're in that situation where you do realize it?
It's a good question. And it is obviously a distinct and very different form of stuckness from, say, just being, I don't even know what to do or where to begin. I just feel really bad. One of the nice things about the stuckness where you know what you're supposed to be doing is you can essentially jump over certain sections of the book and go to the last section. And the last section is about action, and it's about what you're supposed to do. And one of the key principles with stuckness and getting unstuck and finding breakthroughs is that you essentially, no matter how much thinking you do and no matter how much redirecting of your emotions, eventually you have to do something. almost always, in almost all cases. It's not just a matter of reappraisal. And so by doing even small things, by shrinking down the action to its smallest atomic component, you can usually make small bits of progress. One of my favorite examples of this is Jeff Tweedy, the front man from Wilco, the rock band Wilco, who's also a writer. He's a Renaissance man. He does everything creative. But he talks about how he's been a creative for decades, and he wakes up some mornings and he's invigorated, he's ready to go, and he creates amazing things. But then many, many, many mornings he wakes up completely stuck, and he feels like sometimes it's months at a time where he doesn't know what he's supposed to be doing. And in an interview, he said, because I know that acting does two things, I always need to do some action. The one thing it does is it shows me that I'm not stuck. It's the best signal that I'm not stuck is that I'm doing something. And that's really important, to give yourself that signal. But also it greases the wheels. It makes further action more likely and possible. So what he does is he says, he imagines that essentially his brain is like a pond, like a frog pond. And you've got the clean water at the bottom, but then there's some scum on the top. And he says he pours out, this is the term he used, the metaphor, he pours out the bad stuff to reveal the crystal clear water beneath it. And the way he does that is he lowers his threshold for what's an acceptable activity or action as low as it can possibly go. So he'll say to himself, I'm trying to write this piece, this musical piece. I don't know what the next phrase should be, but I'm going to try to write the very worst, most trite bit of music I can write. And he'll do that for 10 minutes. And he says, if you don't have any expectations about quality and it's all about quantity, it's really easy to act, even if you feel stuck. And he says that does a few things. It shows him what he shouldn't be doing, which is actually quite useful. So it gives you something to bounce off and distinguish your further action from. But also he often finds that in doing that, some of the things he's doing that he thinks are terrible are actually not that bad. And they end up forming parts of useful output. So I really like that idea of acting, lowering the threshold, making the action small, the unit small, the quality doesn't matter, and you just have to do something.
This bounces off. I may end up lying about going back to your personal statement.
That's
here,
okay.
Because I think the story you just told glances off a whole bunch of stuff that interests me in the book. One of which is looking at perfectionism, which I think, as you write, turns out to be a great way to get stuck, right? When we're too perfectionist, so kind of lowering that bar so you can do something is one of the main principal takeaways in the book. That one of the main high level takeaways is that you got stuck via a certain mechanism of doing whatever it is we were doing, and to get unstuck, often you need to do something else, and that means just acting, like taking action, so that you can get some feedback in order to make smart pivots. And I think that can be kind of counterintuitive. When I try to think back to some of the times I've felt stuck, maybe my first instinct is actually to spend more time thinking. I don't want to be where I am now. And so I need to do better thinking to figure out where I need to be. And in fact, maybe that's the opposite kind of what you need to do, is actually need to do something, even if it's not the right thing, so that you can start kind of getting feedback and pivot from something instead of nothing. But again, it requires dropping that perfectionism, right? Is maybe just like very intentionally lowering your quality bar for whatever it is you're doing. That feels very counterintuitive, I think.
It is very counterintuitive. And I think that idea that we need to think more, often it's people who overthink chronically, who feel more stuck more often. And often the first instinct of pretty much everyone who's stuck is to think. Like, there's no shortage of thinking. We do a lot of thinking when we're stuck. It's one of the hallmarks. One of the first responses is, I can't stop ruminating over the stuckness that I'm experiencing. So it's very rare for people to say, I'm stuck, and it's a total mystery to me. And it's something that I never really think about, unless they're distancing themselves actively from it, in which case it's it's a psychopathology of its own, which is a problem. But we think plenty. It's very often that we're thinking the wrong things. And so continuing to think only entrenches us further, but that essentially at some point, as you say, you have to do, and you need to leave thinking behind. And that's what Tweedy was saying. He basically said, the only way to stop thinking is to not have the bar so high that you need to be strategic and perfectionist, or to try for excellence, or any of the things that we generally try to do when we're good at what we do, which is what Tweedy is. He basically says anything will do. I could perform like a child who's never really done this before, and that would be better than doing nothing. So that's what I'm going to do.
I wonder if it's trickier for people I was reading some research about having a hobby unrelated to your work, improve self-efficacy. And so I like to take up, as I've gotten more competent in sort of the main things I do, I try to like take up things that I'm incompetent with, because otherwise I think you like lose the ability to be incompetent at something. But it's hard. So like in the last year, I was learning some shuffle dancing, and it's like you go on Instagram and it's like you see the top 0.01% of people trying the thing.
Right.
And I think that can make that feeling, it can just magnify that feeling that like, why would I even try this? So I think there's even maybe more of a barrier, depending on how engaged you are with the unreality of social media than there may have been in the past. This issue, the Tweety story also, I think, gets to a point that I loved in your book called The Creative Cliff Illusion, just as we're talking about creativity here, and the fact that he's willing to just kind of like pump out quantity, right? Well, before I ask you, can you just describe the creative cliff illusion?
Yeah, it's an illusion identified by two psychologists, Lauren Nordgren and Brian Lucas. I was almost forgetting his name. They're both terrific researchers, and they both study creativity. And what they discovered was that when you ask people, do your best ideas come early, or do they come after you've spent a bit of time trying to come up with good ideas? And this is in a huge range of tasks. It's whether you're a novice. So one of the tasks was think of some creative meals you could serve on Thanksgiving, which is obviously not something we all have done much of. And it happens also with experts. So they do this work with comedians, asking them to come up with jokes. And what they find is that people assume that their best ideas are going to come up early or not at all. So if my first 5 ideas are no good, there's no way idea 15 or 20 or 25 is going to be any good. And so they call this the creative cliff, the idea that your ideas and the quality of your ideas falls off a cliff very soon after you begin a period of ideation. And it's called the creative cliff illusion because it's not true. That actually what happens over time is you get better at creative tasks. And if you think about it, the stuff that comes easily to you, those first few ideas are often trite. They're what the herd is thinking, what everyone else is thinking. They come to you easily because they're part of the cultural soup that you're immersed in. And so they're not particularly interesting or novel. And they're rated as such by other people. So when we look at those ideas, they are rated as not very interesting. But if you keep going beyond the point where it starts getting hard, the fact that it starts getting hard, we generally interpret that to mean I'm not doing very well at something. That's metacognition. That's this sort of overarching sense of how it feels to do any mental task. If it feels hard, I'm probably not very good at it. I'm not very fluent and so on. But with creativity, when it starts getting hard, you start to diverge from whatever the middle road is. And that's when interesting things happen. And so if you just persevere to idea 10 or 15 or 20, magic will start to happen, but you have to get there. And most people, because of this illusion, never actually get there because they say, well, it's getting hard. I'm obviously starting to produce worse ideas.
So that's like, I mean, again, that gets to Tweety's sort of, you pour out the bad ideas on the top so that you can get to the ideas underneath it. But I also think that really kind of goes against a lot of sort of cultural folklore, or something that's in the ether for us about creativity, right? As you think it's a first instinct, right? Like think of the Beat Generation writers. It was first thought, best thought, right?
Yeah.
And they obviously had a very unique style. Or I mean, this is a little different than creativity, but I remember in high school being advised, like when you were taking the SATs, it's like, if you don't know, you go with your first instinct, as if there's some magic about your first instinct. Since then, I've read the research that shows actually you're much more likely to get it right if you erase and change your answer on the test instead of going with your first instinct. But there's obviously this sort of preferencing of and our instincts obviously are very useful in situations that we face every day where we sort of have to make snap judgments, which is maybe why it's so difficult to change gears when it comes to creativity and say, like, this first stuff is I just have to do it to get it out of the way, almost as if it's like a warm up or something like that.
Yeah.
To get to where you need to go.
I think you're right. So Nordgren and Lucas talk about 2 lenses for perceiving creativity or understanding creativity. One is the insight lens, and the insight lens is the ones most of us use, and we are steeped in that. We read so much about these geniuses who, in our minds, are just kind of visited with this gift for greatness in creativity. They just are able to do amazing things that we can't imagine doing ourselves. They write great music, they paint great art, they make great films and so on. And so the insight lens suggests that some people have more insight than others. And insight, if it's there all the time, it should make itself known very quickly. And that does happen sometimes. But much more often is the production lens is the more accurate way of perceiving creativity. And the production lens is what we've been talking about. It's the idea that you can't be creative unless you produce. Quantity is critical. And there's a strong relationship between quantity and quality for some of the reasons we've discussed. And when you look at people like Mozart and Einstein, what you see, it's like Instagram. You don't see every moment of everyone's lives. You see the cream of the crop. And so what you see from Einstein, what you see from Mozart makes it seem like it was all insight. And certainly they had a lot of that, but they also just worked damn hard. There are a lot of stories of this for both of them and for many others, that the production lens is a pretty good description of what it was for them to be creative, that they spent ages perfecting the craft.
I like that. Mozart and Einstein are like Instagram. That's
a new one.
Probably a new line to feed into ChatGPT that it hasn't had before.
Yeah.
This also, before we leave the creative cliff illusion, because I think this is a really important one, because I don't think this is, Mozart and Einstein aside, I think just about everybody in their work has an opportunity, if not a demand, to be creative in some way.
Yeah.
And so if many of us are preferencing our first instincts and not, I think it could potentially feel like wasted time if you sit down and say, I need to go through more ideas, which means you don't feel like you're doing, you're not sending an email, you're not like doing something, you're just doing the Jeff Tweedy and pouring off the bad stuff to get to the lower stuff. So unless you really understand the value proposition, maybe that's not something you do. But this was hammered home to me when I was spending a little time with someone, a writer I love, Isabel Allende, who, is one of the best-selling living writers in the world and brilliant person. And her first book, she kind of did say, like, it spoke through me, it poured out of me. That said, she was stuck before it trying to write a novel. And then the way it came about was that she was in exile. She had to flee Chile and live in Venezuela, and got word that her grandfather was dying, and she started writing him a letter that turned into a novel. So it was that frame sort of got her unstuck. But the story that the story gets told over and over and over and over about her, that, she like channeled the voices in that first book, and it's so brilliant. But she's written like 30 other best-selling books. And when I ask her about those ones, she says, if she has already finished the previous book, then every January 8th that she isn't working on a previous book, she will start another book. She has to do that. She has a ritual with starting. And she said it's usually weeks before she writes anything that's usable. Like, she's just there typing stuff, like reading, trying to come up with ideas, full days of weeks where she gets nothing usable until the story starts to gel, which is like, I just don't think most people would have the tolerance to pour that much of the top off.
No, I think you're right. But I think there are two elements. One is a tolerance for that kind of enduring what I guess would be described objectively as failure, right? If that's unusable, then it's not what you need it to be. But also knowing that, I think, is really liberating, because if it starts getting hard, most of the time, say you're learning a language, if it's hard, it means you're disfluent. You're not there yet. You've got more work to do. You're struggling. I think that's what we think about almost every domain. And I think it's almost always true. But this is a domain where it's explicitly the opposite is true, where that hardness is a sign that you're starting to do the right thing. And so that's a really liberating idea, because it turns your naive theory about what the difficulty of the process means on its head. And I think it should make you feel good that almost until it gets hard, that's probably unusable stuff. And so that pushes you forward. But I agree. I mean, months of that is another story. Most people, when they talk about this, it's like periods of an hour or 2 or 3. But that's an extreme example. It's an interesting one.
And what about, again, maybe that doesn't generalize to all areas, but thinking about, a lot of people listening to this have kids who get frustrated with math sometimes, I'm sure. And I think the instinct, I've seen this in action with a lot of parents, is if a kid is frustrated by math, it's to, let me show you this trick, this shortcut that doesn't really like teach them the thing, but it teaches them some kind of hack where they can get through it. And so since when you're really doing the work, sometimes it's supposed to be hard. What do you think about that? Like that instinct to kind of show the quick way. Does that matter for something like our kids learning math?
Yeah, I think it does. I did some research on a concept known as hardship inoculation. And it's this idea that that learning to endure the difficulty of learning something new or trying something new or acquiring a skill is itself valuable later on when you experience other forms of hardship, which are inevitable in, for example, athletic competition. The math problems will get harder. And so if you're struggling as a kindergartner, it's good for you to learn how to do that because it's going to come up in first grade and second grade and third grade. There's a good chance you're going to come up against new concepts that require perseverance and the kind of emotional resilience that you need to deal with and manage and get through that hardship or hardness. So the original research is not on little kids; it's on NCAA basketball teams, and it basically shows that. We did this with some economists, but they basically found that the preseason games, which are often randomly assigned, if you control for everything, but you look at how hard those games are, in other words, how strong are your opponents, there's a very, very strong relationship between how hard it is to play or win those preseason games and how you perform during the season. You're much more likely to overperform during the season if you had hard preseason games. And that a lot of coaches don't want that. They think what you should do is instill confidence. It's giving the kid the little hack so that they start to feel a bit of ease. It's much easier for me to do the thing. But I think sort of stewing in that hardship and getting used to it and letting it wash over you and becoming a little bit sort of zen about it is an incredibly useful domain general skill. So that's the answer to whether you should just push hardness aside. I don't think you should. There's a lot of evidence that you shouldn't. I'm not talking about injury or pain. I'm talking about hardness that you can tolerate. And so in the case of kids doing math, I think it's really important to develop a sort of general overarching strategy for dealing with the hardship that comes from learning this new stuff. And you're never going to do that if you're pushed aside to the next thing.
It's also the fact that if something is really easy, then you're probably definitely not learning because it means like you're not, right? It's like lifting the same weights the same number of times every day. You might not get worse, but you're not going to get better. You're not going to cause that adaptation, right?
Right, exactly.
I want to ask one more thing before I switch gears a little bit. There's a part in the book that I just thought was a great piece of reporting about flight inspections of commercial airplanes. And you really went through this sequence. Like I had, I fly a lot. I had no idea that there is this sort of staggered sequence of levels of inspection that occur for planes where it's like to keep them, because I think the commercial air industry, like obviously if the last experience that you had on Monday was a flight delay, then you think it's the worst. But if you can zoom out, it's pretty amazing. Like the safety record, the continuous operation. And apparently, as you write, that's enabled by this system where sort of cursory checks are done very frequently, medium depth checks are done medium rarely, and like really deep engineering checks are done less rarely. So it's this sliding scale of the depth of the check versus the frequency. And both, I was just wondering how you did that reporting, because I thought it was just so cool to read about. Like, I'm always fascinated by that, something that I've walked past a million times, and then get some insight into like what's going on out the plane window when people are scurrying around. So it gave me sort of a different view of that. Curious how you did that reporting, and then also what the heck that has to do with being in a book about getting unstuck.
Yeah, that's in a section on preventive maintenance. So one of the things you asked about very early on was, do people ever get stuck? They don't realize they're stuck, and then maybe it gets worse or they get further entrenched. And one of the arguments that I make quite early on is that, yes, often we fall into traps where we're a little bit stuck. It's not quite the level of fully stuck yet, but we're a little bit stuck, and we should probably do some things to fix the situation. But if we do that, we're going to take resources away from other things that feel more immediate. So we generally leave things as they are, and they get worse and worse and worse. And so I talk about applying the idea, the concept of the engineering concept of preventive maintenance to these small instances of preliminary pre-stuckness. And that's where I talk about a number of examples, some of the medical, in a whole lot of different domains. But I do talk about the A, B, C, D level checks that happen for planes. And you described it perfectly. The A and B level checks are much more frequent. Some of them happen every day or after every flight, and they're very cursory. And then there are the big ones, the D checks, which happen every couple of years or every few years. The reporting for that, I was inspired to report on that from this incredible YouTube channel. This is a total digression, but there's a YouTube channel. This guy's name is, I don't know what his name is actually, but the channel is called Mentor Pilot, Mentor. He's a Swedish pilot. And he began by producing these videos for people who are sort of, I'm not a very nervous flyer, but I was historically. And I think at a certain point, I was like, I want to learn as much as I can about planes, because I know that, as you say, that whole industry is just, it's a marvel. And I think the more you know about them, the noises they make, the things they do, the more you realize that things are actually okay, even though they might feel like they're not okay. And so I embraced that, and I started to do a lot of research. And this guy has these videos where he talks about, this is what this sound means, and this is what this thing means, and let me tell you about this. But he also has a series now that I find totally fascinating on incidents, often not catastrophic, but incidents. And then he'll say, here's why that didn't work out. They didn't do the B-level check. And I was like, what's a B-level check? What does that mean? And I went down this full rabbit hole. I did a huge amount of research, reading some of the documents from the FAA and other airline bodies. And they explain the whole process. And every airline has or should have some version of this. So that's the journalistic answer to your question. Was I just went down a rabbit hole and found it fascinating.
And that, obviously that is a digression, but at the same time, I think there are aspects in your book that talk about, well, being globally curious, right? Like engaging, being open to, finding ways to, the way that I thought of what you're describing in your book is finding ways, whether it's addressing specific questions and looking at lots of different potential solutions for some problem or question, or just kind of being more generally curious. It was like, get longer antennas out into the world.
Yeah.
So that you're receiving sort of more stuff, almost as if it's like that gives you more opportunities to pivot and become unstuck from whatever you're doing. And so, I mean, that's a me search, right? You were doing a me search and found something that, oh, there's more here,
Exactly.
and it turns into a project. So I want to pivot to another issue, because one of the things, so clearly one of the main takeaways, I mean, I think if I remember correctly, correct me if I'm wrong, that Angela Duckworth, the author of Grit, is one of the people who blurbed your book, and her blurb said something about, this puts research behind the idea that action above all, like have a bias for action to get unstuck. Yeah, that is a huge takeaway from the book. At the same time, this book to me is very much like a kind of constructivist approach of, it's not like always take action. It's much more, if you're here, then try this. If you're there, then try this. So I think going through the book, I was sort of looking for myself, what situation do I feel in a given place, and which strategy is then sort of prescribed in for that. And so as much as it does talk about having a bias for action in some cases, and doing the Tweety and getting stuff out there and dropping your perfectionism, there are parts of the book that are pretty fascinating that talk about when to stop, or when to be patient, or when to pull back. And one of my favorite stories involved Leo Messi, for anyone who's watching the recent World Cup. So I was wondering if you could tell, just in brief, sort of the story you tell in the book that I think sort of presents in opposition to some of the things that we've highlighted so far.
Yeah, so I think action above all is the sort of last resort, right? This is where you feel like nothing's working and you're really stuck, and the only thing that matters now is the Jeff Tweedy approach, which is to do anything. But you don't start there. Like if you feel stuck, or you've just noticed that you're stuck, you don't just suddenly start flailing. We're very good at getting unstuck physically, actually. So when you're physically trapped, humans are well designed to get out of that situation. We have the fight or flight response, adrenaline courses through our body, and so on. But we tend to do a bad job of that when we feel emotionally or intellectually stuck. But the case with Lionel Messi that's really fascinating for me is at the other end of the spectrum. So I start the book by saying, before you get to action and thought, you have to deal with the fact that emotionally it can be very overwhelming to be stuck. One universal, when I ask people about their experiences of stuckness from thousands of people around the world, is they all say, this sucks. And I really feel bad. They put it in different ways, and some of them are more articulate about it, but no one enjoys that experience of suddenly realizing they're stuck. It's not surprising, but you have to deal with it first. You have to sort of accept it. And what Lionel Messi did that I found totally fascinating was that as a young player, he was famously anxious and is generally an anxious person, which a lot of people are surprised to hear this about Messi, who is, I think, one of the greatest soccer players of all time, and possibly the greatest current player. But Messi talks, his coaches in particular talked about the fact that when he was young, they said, he's so nervous. Sometimes he's physically sick before his matches. We can't imagine that he's ever going to be a really good player, or that he'll ever be able to lead other players. And so what he started to do, this was an idea that he got from one of his coaches as he rose up through the ranks. His coach said to him, you know what, you are so talented that I think we can sacrifice you as a team for the first couple of minutes of the game. Why don't you spend the first between, say, 2 and 4, maybe 5 minutes of the game, not really playing? So as the whistle blows, just sort of amble around, get your bearings, take some deep breaths, have a mantra, whatever it is you need to do, and just watch everyone else. It's almost as though you're floating above the field, watching everyone else play the game. Don't do that for no purpose. Do it to develop a tactical advantage. So watch the other players closely, learn about them. Is there perhaps a pair of players on the other side who are connecting very well and that you should watch out for the remainder of the game? Are there players on your own team who are not connecting the way they should? Is there a particular player who's injured but has not told anyone? You know, those kinds of insights that you can have when you're really focused on the right things, but you can't do that while also playing feverishly. So if you track the movement of players for those first few minutes of the game, it's really interesting because you see all these players darting around and Messi's like ambling. He's barely moving in the center circle. He's also never scored a goal in the first 2 minutes of the game, but has scored in every minute from 3 to 90 plus. So he's really not playing the game until the 3rd or 4th minute of the game, which I think is a really phenomenal lesson that you can be the very best in the world at something, but allow yourself that time to take in what's going on, calm yourself down, perhaps be a little more strategic in those moments. It sort of licenses him to pause and to develop a better strategic understanding of the surrounds. And that's, to me, the fact that he's able to do that. There are lots of other examples of talented people who do it too, but I think it's a really interesting lesson for everyone else.
And again, do you think this gets at something? I do. I mean, I said something fundamental about your book, which is that it's like an if-then journey, right? And I mean, I think that makes sense, right? These things are complicated. I'm sure there's a million different ways that people get stuck. And so there have to be sort of a lot of different ways to get unstuck, which I really enjoyed because at book length, I don't want to read something that I know is an unrealistically like tidy answer for the complexities of things on which people get stuck in life.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you had like advice for the way that people read your book. My feeling would be that in reading it, they will recognize themselves probably not everywhere, but very likely somewhere. And will say like, that's a thing I can try. Like there's a lot of stuff you can try in there. That's how I felt about it.
Yeah, I mean, I hope that's true. And when I was writing the book, there were sections where I was writing something, and then I'd remember, oh yeah, I remember that one particularly resonant response from someone to that survey that I mentioned that I was conducting all through the writing and continue to conduct. You know, someone would say, I'm struggling with this particular aspect of my life. And then I'd realize, hey, is there something in here for that person? And what about this other person? What about that person? And they are different things for different people. I think you can think of it as a kind of if-then journey where, you know, I mentioned earlier that, you know, if your emotions are in check, you feel totally fine about the situation you're in, but it still feels like you'd like to be able to do something different. You don't have to spend a lot of time working with the emotional consequences of stuckness. You can move right on to strategy and action. And then there are some people who are like, I know exactly what I need to do. I just really am struggling with the emotional consequences of feeling pinned in. And so for them, that first section is really relevant and important. And then I think the section on cognitive strategies, which we haven't talked about much yet, that section, I think that there are useful ideas there for all cases of stuckness, or most cases of stuckness, because that to me, a lot of those strategies are very domain general. They apply across a lot of different contexts.
Before we leave Messi, since you mentioned that he was kind of famously nervous, you know, to the point of getting sick, you talk in the book about something that's near and dear to my heart, which is what I think of as low stakes practice. So when I got off in my past life, I was training to be an environmental scientist and became a writer, and boy, was I not good at talking to strangers. So which is a slight problem in journalism. And not only that, but because I was coming from this oddball background, the only place that I could get any steady work initially was as the guy who starts at midnight to the morning at a New York tabloid, which is like, as you can imagine, nothing happy that's going in New York Daily News happens between midnight and 10 a.m. But it does require a lot of talking to strangers in awkward situations. And I was just not good at it. So I would go out and try to kind of practice in the day, even if I had to go into, I remember there was a blackout in New York and I was supposed to go talk to store owners, you know, who were having problems. And I'm like I would always buy something in the store because I had to like be a customer first before that was me. So I started doing things like trying to talk to people in an elevator because everyone's getting off soon, right? And so as awkward as it is, at least it's limited, you know? And so I thought it was really interesting to see that you tell your students to, when they get into an elevator, sometimes to turn around and face an opposite direction from anyone else in the elevator. And I'm curious if you can describe how you came up with that and how your students react to that.
Yeah, this is an old study that I replicate in some of my own instruction. I haven't done it for a few years, but when I teach a psychology course, I'll often do it. It's a study on norms, and the original research was done by a very famous social psychologist named Stanley Milgram. And in the 70s, he asked his students, some of his grad students, to get on the subway in New York and ask people to get up out of their seats without a reason. So you walk up to someone on a subway who's sitting down, you say, "Excuse me, may I have your seat, please?" And what almost always happens is they assume you're totally unhinged because you're not supposed to talk to people on the subway, let alone ask them for something. So if you ask them, they're like, "This person's kind of crazy. I'm going to do whatever he or she is asking." So usually you get compliance. But what happened, what was so interesting to Milgram was his students would come back to him just shaking like a leaf. And they were like, "That was the most harrowing experience of my life, having to ask that question." And he thought that was ridiculous. He was like, "What do you mean? You're doing a PhD. You've got to do all that. You've got to do an oral defense in front of an audience. There are so many things you do that sound like they're higher stakes than that. That sounds like a trifle. That's not a big deal at all." And so they said to him, you go do it. We'll come on the subway with you and watch you do it. And he said exactly the same thing. This violation of norms is so deeply unpleasant that it really makes you feel physically sick. And so I've done this very much lower stakes version of it, is to face the wrong way in the elevator. You know, and you're supposed to get in an elevator and face the doors. You tell people, for example, get in the elevator and just face everyone else. You just kind of stand there, which again, people assume you're unhinged. But the idea is to show the power of social norms. But the interesting side effect of this that Milgram had talked about at various times was that there's something unbelievably empowering about enduring that hardship, about practicing with these are low stakes situations. Usually nothing happens. You know, people might assume you're unhinged, but as you say, in the elevator, they're there for 10 seconds and then they leave, and then you can go on about your day. And he talked about how some of them felt strangely empowered by this. It's a little bit of hardship inoculation, right? If I could endure the discomfort of violating the social norm, maybe I could do other things that I didn't think I could do. And that's the origin of that little experiment.
I think we all need some more of that low stakes practice. And I especially wonder now with electronic communication, like I noticed when I started in journalism, if I got a phone number, I would just call it. Like I'd call a lab, and if somebody picked up, I'd ask for the person I was looking for. Like I remember I walked into SI and I got a phone number like lying around for John McEnroe. I'm like, all right, I'll call. I did get yelled at by his agent, but I'm like, if there was a number, I'd call it. Now much more, it's like, oh, you should email the person to set it up and text and things like that. And I wonder with people who've really grown up with all electronic communication, it's maybe there's not enough awkwardness, can actually impede you sometimes. If you don't
it's fascinating about this is about banking, but I think it applies to communication in general, that in the 60s, 70s, and even into the 80s and 90s, when banks were trying to design a frictionless experience for their customers, they would introduce modes of communication that required two humans. So I will speak to a human. And people said, that the easiest thing for me to do is to stand in front of a human and tell them my problems, and then they'll give me feedback. In 2023, it's the opposite. If you're a bank and you require people to speak to someone, that is the most friction-filled experience you can construct. And so everything is about extending remoteness as far as it can possibly go, to chatting with bots and sending text messages and all of that. So that norm has completely changed. And the amount of anxiety that young people feel having to use a phone to dial a random number, I know a little bit of it from my own experiences talking to some of my students, and that was relevant to my last book as well. But you're right, it's a really big shift.
Okay, we only have a few minutes left, so I want to glance off a couple other quick things here. I want to read you. I know I found this letter from, you mentioned Mozart, and I think Mozart, along with I think Tiger Woods is probably the most impactful stories of development. They've done a lot of work in culture in terms of stories of development. And this section of this letter I'm going to read you is from Mozart's father, and struck me when I was doing some research because it just didn't comport with what I thought of Mozart from absorbing, this like guy with his head always on fire kind of prodigy. And so here's Leopold Mozart in translation, obviously, writing to a friend, and he's describing his son, Wolfgang Mozart. He says, he's far too patient, or rather easygoing, too indolent, perhaps even too proud. In short, he has the sum total of all those traits which render a man inactive. Again, not how I think of Mozart. On the other hand, he's too impatient, too hasty, and will not bide his time. If he's not actually in want, then he's immediately satisfied and becomes indolent and lazy. If he has to bestir himself, then he realizes his worth and wants to make his fortune all at once. And I just thought that was fascinating, both because Mozart's father was calling him lazy, which was not the wisdom that I had received, but also it's so contradictory. Like he's saying he's lazy, except when he's not, then he's completely like in a rush. And I think there was a frame in your book that made that make a lot more sense to me. And I was wondering if you could explain that for people listening.
Yeah, so to me, first of all, I would say that there are some people who exist at a sort of steady state of activity. They're much steadier. Like whenever you find them, they're going at a 6 or a 7 out of 10. But what you've described there in Leopold Mozart's letter is someone who I think very adaptively, I think this is a good thing to be able to do, is you turn on the afterburners. Sometimes you're incredibly productive at a 9 or a 10, but you can't always be at a 9 or a 10. And so what you do instead is you turn everything down to a 1 or a 2, and you leave things idling along as you recover, you recoup whatever resources you need, and then you move up to the next step, and you do the next thing. And that's, I think, what was going on for Mozart. And there are really interesting descriptions of both Mozart and of Einstein doing exactly this, where they go feverishly at certain points. The most famous one, though, is Einstein, who would spend literally hours lying on his back. It's the best visual, is to imagine Einstein lying on his back staring at the ceiling. He would just do that, and he would describe it. He'd just say, I get to a certain point where I'm exhausted, and this is what I do. And he lies and stares at the ceiling. And I think that's what Leopold Mozart was seeing in his son. And I think the reinterpretation of that is that's exactly what you should be doing. You should have downtime, and you should absolutely have a very engaged moments of deep flow when you're very engrossed in the work you're doing, that from the outside makes it seem like you're going at a 9 or a 10. I think there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. And I think it's a recipe for success.
So I want to give one more question. I know we have just like a minute or two before Lonnie comes back in. One more question, and then I just want to read one quote that I think captures an idea that I hope people keep. So this last question, I'll try to be quick. You have a great story in the book about the swimmer David Burkhoff, who is not only one of the best in the world, but also an innovator who creates techniques that are so effective that they get banned in swimming. And you write about his coach. That his coach learned that David Burkhoff loved sampling, hated to practice, but not good for a swimmer, right? They have long practice hours, but loved trying new techniques. So the way he got him to train was by teaching him new methods at the end of practice sessions. It was sort of, he said, he doesn't like this. But often I think we might say, well, someone doesn't like to train, like, sorry, you're out. And this really reminded me of talking to Sue Enquist, who is was the UCLA softball coach, I think the winningest NCAA coach in any sport ever. And what she described to me was she thought of her athletes as competitors and achievers. And the competitors were people who were motivated by the game. They didn't like to train so much. So you had to kind of sometimes manage them to train enough to be prepared for the game. Or if you wanted them to train, you had to put competitions in practice. Whereas the achievers, you told them to do anything and they were going all out. So you had to pull them back because they might get overstrung for the game. And so seeing these two frames, it wasn't saying like these ones are broken or these ones are broken. It was like, how do you motivate? How do you change this person's environment to get the sort of outcome you want? And I thought that just was a kind of brilliant story, that whether you're a parent, a mentor, a coach, that you need to have this mindset of looking out for, it's not like the training itself that's the secret, but individualizing the way that an individual gets unstuck, basically, that there's like a tailoring to that kind of solution. I don't know if I'm not saying that very eloquently, but
No, I totally agree. I think that's right. And actually, when I spoke to Berkhoff, who you connected me with, which I very much appreciate, thank you for that. He said that. He's like, I owe everything to my coach, Joe Bernal. He was this coach at Harvard. And he was not just innovative in his techniques, but innovative in saying, let's figure out what you need as an individual and give it to you. And so for Berkhoff, it was temptation bundling. Temptation bundling is when you say, I've got to eat the broccoli, but I also want the dessert. I'm going to make sure that every time I have the broccoli, I reward myself by having some dessert afterwards. And that's what he did with practice for Berkhoff. And I think it's an incredibly useful idea for getting people to do something they don't really want to do, is tethering it to something they really do want to do.
Okay, I know I'm 2 minutes over, but I just want to read a quick quote that I think gets at a lot of issues in the book, because there's a lot in the book about pivoting, changing, right? When you're stuck, something needs to change, and change is hard. And I think can be sort of stigmatized, right? Because we often think of it as quitting. But in one section, you write that avoiding pivots, right? Because a lot of in the book is about pivoting from things that obviously haven't been working, even though our instinct, I guess, is often to continue doing things that weren't necessarily working. Avoiding pivots means never changing your mind. Marrying the first person you date, pursuing the first career you dream of as a child, living in the same town your entire life, and so on. Humans develop and mature across the lifespan, and our preferences and attitudes shift as well. We learn and grow, so change is inevitable. I just thought that was an eloquent quote, and how to make that change productive instead of frightening, I think is some of the subtext on just about every page of the book. So I enjoyed it tremendously, as hopefully everyone here can tell. And thanks, Adam. It's always a pleasure to get to pick your brain.
You too, Dave. Thank you so much for doing this. I appreciate it. That was fun.
Pleasure.
David, excellent interview. Thank you for your very thoughtful, careful preparation. I wish I could clone you across 57 programs every year. Thank you so much. Really,
pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Just brought all the best out. I know, Adam, you were well served by that interview. I know you know that. So, thank you so much, everybody.